So let's discuss some key features and aspects of markets. And really, when economists talk about markets, they idealize what's called a perfect market. So, in the theory of economics, there are some elements that make a market function really well. And if you could have each of these elements perfect, then the market is believed to be functioning in a perfectly efficient manner. So let's talk about what these are. So in a perfect market, there are a large number of sellers and buyers. So this should be and buyers. Okay, so why is this a feature of a perfect market? Because you don't want any one particular seller or buyer to control the market. Okay, so each seller should be uh, able to sell into the market, and by them selling into it, they're not going to really change the market. Okay, they're just one little player in this larger kind of aggregating entity. The market is large enough to just kind of function without being influenced by any one particular firm. It's just it works as kind of an aggregation of everything. So this is kind of like voting, where people say, this particular constituency is important to the election, but any one person in that constituency, let's say it's college educated women. Okay, so that constituency may be important to win an election for a particular party, but there's no single person in that that's necessarily going to change the election. It's the aggregation of everyone. It's the same thing with markets. You want the sellers and buyers to just be participating in the market, but not controlling it in any way by being such a large proportion of the market as to be able to control it. You want to have these sellers and buyers trading in the same product. Okay, so if there's any level of product differentiation, like by quality or by branding, then that's going to make the market not this ideal perfect market, because then you kind of get into this little thing of like monopolies, like Coca-Cola Corporation. Yes, they are in the market for beverages, but the branding of their particular uh, the, the Coca-Cola brand makes it kind of like a little monopoly. They're the only ones selling Coca-Cola. So in an ideal perfect market, you want these firms to be selling the same product. You want perfect information for all the participants in the market. So you don't want one person having better information than the other. I can think of an example. I was listening to this podcast about this family who had been in the lamb trade, the trade lambs, and so this was in rural England. So there was one of the kind of grandfather generation people was the first to get an automobile. So what he would do is drive to some other market and find out the pricing there for for the lambs, and then basically see if he could buy it in his home market for cheaper. And since he had a car, he could kind of do the traveling real time. And so what he would do is just buy. If the lamb was selling for $100 in one market, he could buy it in his home market for 90. He would kind of do that and then just sell it in the other market for 100 and collect that $10 spread. Uh, because he had just better information. He knew what was happening in that other market better than the people in his home market. So, this is gonna if that kind of information disparity exists between buyers and sellers, then that market is not going to be efficient. No barriers to entry or exit. So, uh, as a market kind of changes, there's dynamics. Buyers and sellers produce less or more of a good. Prices fluctuate. uh, Usually, what happens in a market is if there's a larger profit to be made in one market, you'll have new firms enter to try to capture that extra return. So if you have barriers that prevent new firms from entering, or kind of firms that are not performing well to exit, then the market is not going to perform as well. No state intervention. Okay, so uh, this is kind of related to the last one because the state often makes barriers. Like if you wanted to start a bank, it's virtually It's not impossible, of course, but it's very, very difficult to get through the regulatory hurdles to start a new bank. Okay, so a lot of the barriers to entry and exit are related to this uh, governmental intervention in markets. So the state can intervene in markets in many ways, not just barriers to entry. They can force certain firms to do things. Like if if you're a large corporation, the government may put special rules for you or advantage you in certain ways over smaller firms. Um, and so this intervention by the state will distort the market in certain ways. And then perfectly mobile resources. So basically, this is also related to the entry and exit of firms. You want resources like capital, like a factory. If there's a better use for a particular asset in one market versus another, you want to be able to facilitate that because you want your markets. There's many markets, right? For different products and services, and you want in order for those to all operate efficiently, you need kind of movement between them of your limited and scarce resources of your society. Not just capital assets, but labor, right? So if you had a bunch of like coal miners, okay, this is a good example of an imperfection where you had coal miners working in that industry in Appalachia. The coal mines, this is through government regulation, largely have kind of become obsolete because to have a coal-fired power plant is very difficult because of environmental regulation. So all those workers are kind of out of work and they're not perfectly mobile. It's hard for them to move and just pick up and move somewhere else. They don't have the skills. So you don't have a perfectly mobile resource, which I guess is a good segue into imperfect markets because there's there there are probably markets that come close to being perfect, but really most markets for the goods and services we use are imperfect. Okay, so uh, let's look at these. So if you have this large number of buyers and sellers, this condition being broken, you're going to have one of these here. Okay, this is a monopoly is when there's only one seller, essentially. Okay, an oligopoly is when there's very few sellers. There's not just one, but maybe there's five. But each of those five has such a large segment of the market, they effectively function as a monopoly. Okay, this uh, condition of large number of buyers and sellers, it actually does mean a large number. It doesn't just mean more than one. Okay, a monopsony is when there's only one buyer. Okay, so what is an example of this? You can think of um, who is buying fighter jets from Boeing? Okay, yes, they sell to governments, but really, there's one big buyer, and it's the U.S. government. Okay, so a monopsony is when a business, like the defense sector, for example, only has one major customer. So that's a good example where the federal government is it's one major customer, and so the federal government has a large amount of control over these firms because all those firms rely on it being their single customer. Monopolistic competition. Uh, this is a this is kind of related to different products where you have competition. We can talk about Coca-Cola, for example. So soft drinks, there's many varieties of soft drinks, but they're all differentiated. So each firm is kind of controlling its own portfolio of uh, differentiated products. So they're all competing. You can say in the same market of soda, but they are carving their own little niches out. When there's barriers to entry, okay, so I talked about banking. This is an example of an imperfect market, and then asymmetric information. So uh, this happens when some parties in the market have more or better information than others. So an example of this is health insurance. So uh, the government has kind of intervened in this, forcing the insurance companies to kind of insure everybody. But if you have a medical condition and uh, the insurance company was not like if they want to be able to just insure healthier people because if they just insure a very unhealthy person who has already a existing condition, they're just going to start having to pay out. And so you as the individual know your health situation better than the insurance company. So there's an asymmetry of information. a used car salesman, they're gonna have bought the car. Maybe they had to fix it up, and they know that there's some big problem with it, but you may not know that. Okay, as the buyer. Okay, so this is another uh, breaking of this perfect information kind of criteria criterion for a perfect market. A breaking of this perfectly mobile resource. I gave the example of the of labor markets. You know, you can't just shift around labor easily. Um, there's also like fixed assets, like a oil refinery. You know, you can't just move that somewhere else where it's needed. So you know, that's an example of how some resources are fixed, are like not perfectly mobile. So in the real world, you know, most markets have some imperfection or another. Some are very imperfect. Some are only minorly imperfect, but it's very rare to really find a perfect market. Maybe you could argue the oil, the market for oil is somewhat like that because there's so many different sellers of oil, but there are still large like Saudi Arabia, um, Venezuela, maybe not so much because their economy's not doing so well and their production is probably not that good. But there are certain larger players in the oil market where maybe it's not totally perfect, um, but yeah, maybe like iron ore. There's wheat. There's maybe some markets you could argue are close to perfect. Okay, and then now I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on price. Uh, the role of prices in a market economy is central. Um, Basically, we've talked about scarcity and economizing, right? Where you have scarce resources and you need to figure out the most efficient way to use those resources. This is a massive coordination problem. Okay, you need to basically see what resources are available, what resources are needed, where they're needed. You need to see what consumers want. So there's a demand component there. And then there's all these societal situations. There's wars. Uh, for example, during COVID, uh, that situation in society totally changed the dynamics for what goods and services were uh, kind of being in demand, right? E-commerce, ordering things online skyrocketed. Uh, People just stopped going to malls, so you know, retail space the demand for that went down. Office space, that all went down. People just started demanding different things. Okay, so this coordination problem amongst all the different goods and services, all the resources being used in society, it's extremely complicated. I think during the Soviet Union, which was a centrally planned economy where there are people trying to decide what should be produced and how to do that, they were trying to deal with 24 million different things. Okay, all the different goods and services in a society. Okay, now doing that coordination in a dynamic system for even if you took the smartest people in society, it's a very daunting problem. Okay, so what prices act as is a distributed information system. Okay, so you as an economic actor don't need to know what's happening in every part of the economy. You just need to deal with the prices for the things that your particular business is interacting with. So, if you're a cheese producer, you need to know the price of milk. You know the price of cheese. You know the price of your workers. There's only a certain number of things you need to know to do your business. Okay, and you acting is going to kind of add to this information system because when you hire workers, that's going to create some demand pull for workers. Maybe the wage rate is going to go up if you and all your competitors are trying to get workers because the demand for cheese is so high. So you know, and then that demand for cheese is going to be high because the price of cheese is high, and maybe people really want cheese badly. So uh, all these things, all these different prices are interlinked. Okay, the interactions between prices, goods, and services is extremely complicated, and for any human and even group of humans to be able to figure that out, and especially as things are changing, it's historically no one's been able to do it in a very good way. What's worked better is just to let prices and markets determine it, and just have economic actors worry about the prices that matter to their business. Okay. The other point about prices is price controls. Okay, so uh, prices don't cause shortages. Okay, so uh, for example, let's say the price of um, bread went up 10x. Okay, Th- that price increase is the result of a shortage. It's not causing the shortage. Okay, if if your economy was functioning well, then the producers of bread would be selling to the market. Okay. When the price goes up, that means that the supply of bread somehow is experiencing a disruption. Okay. And therefore, those who have bread are going to charge more because there's fewer loaves to go around. Okay. Now, what happens often is that people blame that big increase in price. They blame that on why people can't get it. Okay, that's the wrong way of looking at it. It's like a ostrich sticking its head in the sand. The reality is that there's a shortage of that thing. Okay, so what oftentimes happens is that government officials say, "Hey, this price has gone up too much, and we're gonna force the price to be lower." Okay, so that only makes things worse because if you have a shortage of something and you lower the price of it, the incentive for producers to make more goes away, and the incentive for alternatives to that particular shortage to also kind of be produced also goes away. So you just exacerbate the shortage. You still will have fewer items to go around, um, and you'll eventually kind of kill that market. Okay, so this is why you can take the example of Venezuela, which has oil reserves on par with Saudi Arabia. It's an extremely wealthy country by resources, but they had a government come into place which basically put price controls on everything, and the entire kind of private industry of uh, producers of goods and services there just all went out of business. The government kind of crowded everyone out through its price controls, and that country is basically a its standard of living decreased dramatically, and have they have oil shortages. Okay, they can't even get fuel for their cars, um, even though they're sitting on massive oil reserves. Okay, so this is the short-sightedness of political leaders to try to make people happy without understanding the root cause of why the price has gone up. If you saw price like housing prices, if you saw the price of housing go up, instead of putting caps on the cost of housing, what you should do is encourage building. Okay, add more supply. That's going to lower the prices and lead to people actually having the thing that they want. One more thing to add about prices. When you have a system of markets and prices determining kind of uh, the transaction value of things, when people actually enter into a transaction at a particular price, they're both mutually agreeing that there is a benefit. Okay. The seller is like, okay, I'm happy with this price. I'm going to sell it. And the buyer is like, I'm willing to pay this price and I'm going to buy it. You could say the labor markets are the same, where there's a wage that's offered for a certain job. The employer is saying, I'm willing to pay this much to have someone do this job. And the employee is saying, okay, I'm willing to do this job for that amount. Now, is that perfect? No, because uh, people are oftentimes not mobile. They're going to be subject to the kind of wages prevailing in their particular area that they live. And it's not easy to just pick up and move somewhere where there's higher wages. Okay, so because there's all sorts of other factors that keep people living in the place they're living. Um, so it's not perfect. It's not a perfect system, but you can say in general that the system does require some level of consent between both parties to transact, or else there just wouldn't be a transaction. So in this way, there's no, there's the least amount of coercion. How about we put it like that? There's the least amount of coercion in kind of economic life under this system.